Recently, we saw a grim anniversary. That is the 15th anniversary of the war in Iraq. Here to discuss that with us now is Stephen Miles. Stephen has been on the program before. He is the executive director of Win Without War, which was and is a diverse coalition of 40 or more groups that have come together for the purpose of redirecting and improving our policies in the area of foreign policy and particularly military policy. And first of all, Stephen, thank you for coming back on the program.
Glad to be here, RJ.
Secondly, if my memory serves me correctly, your organization was actually created in response to the original move to invade Iraq. Is that correct?
That is, yeah. Win Without War was created in the fall of 2002 in the run-up to the Iraq War, right around the time of the vote to authorize the Iraq War that fall. And of course, as you just said, we just marked the milestone of the 15th anniversary of the first bombs falling as part of that war in 2003.
And so before we get into the recent article you co-wrote, we are still, in a way, in a very large way, enmeshed in that war, are we not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we're going to talk about America's relationship with Iraq, we obviously also need to acknowledge the first Gulf War, the first war in Iraq, more than a decade before the 2003 invasion. And so whether it's the bombing and the war making that we're still seeing today, the war that came during the 90s, or obviously the disastrous invasion and occupation under George W. Bush in 2003, the U.S. has been trying to bomb our way to peace for quite a long time in Iraq, and I think the results, unfortunately, speak for themselves.
Yeah, I think they do as well, and I think we had a strong repudiation in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, with the change of congressional leadership in 2006. We could name some other elections perhaps, but I think even Donald Trump's cynical decision to pretend when he ran for president in 2016 that he always opposed the war in Iraq, which was hardly the truth. Imagine that, Donald Trump not telling the truth. But I think one thing we can say is that the American people have shown time and again that aside from the fervor that people were whipped into in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, that people understand that this war was a mistake, don't you think?
I think that's right. And I think that as we mark this anniversary, as we think back on the history of the war, I do think we need to start with understanding and recognizing the human costs of this war. Because I think obviously that's what drives the sentiment about how disastrous this has been. Whether it's the more than 4,000 American soldiers who lost their lives, or the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, we'll never know the full total who lost their lives. The human costs of this war were absolutely enormous and completely devastating. And I do think it's important to start there. But you bring up a really good point about the political costs of this war. And that's exactly why we wrote this article. It's worth looking back because certainly at the time, there was a lot of folks who thought the politically advantageous thing to do was to support George W. Bush, who at the time had an approval rating up near 70%, and support that war. The conventional wisdom in Washington is certainly that supporting wars tends to be good for good politics. When we looked back at this, we took a methodical examination of each and every member of Congress from 2002, how they voted on the war and what happened to them. The results speak for themselves. It was absolutely not politically in your favor to vote for a war that has come to be viewed by history as a massive mistake.
Well, that's interesting. And obviously, we would hope that our elected officials vote their consciences and their understanding rather than what would seem politically expedient. But I think the point of the article that you co-wrote with Erica Fine was that even on the level of political expediency, what may seem safe in the short term is not necessarily even smart politically in the long term, right? What was your methodology for looking at that?
Yeah, so it started pretty simply. We went back, we looked at everyone in 2002, how they voted, which way they came down for or against. Then we went through and we looked each and every one of them. There was 6 members of Congress who didn't vote, actually. There was a couple of vacancies and some were not there. But when you look at the ones who did vote, we went through and we saw Did they die in office, which is the case for 15 of them? Did they retire of their own volition? Or did they get kicked out of office, either by losing a primary or losing a general election? And when you then look down at those who left office involuntarily, what you see is a clear trend that it was far more likely to cause you to lose your race if you voted for the Iraq War than if you voted against the Iraq War. Now, a lot of factors go into that. Certainly, some of those races were many years later, and the Iraq War was not a defining feature in that particular election. But when you take a step back and you look at it in totality, certainly there was a lot of folks who thought being hawkish on these issues, voting for war, would save them if they were Democrats. That wasn't the case. And Republicans who thought it would insulate them, and that wasn't the case either.
You know, that's very interesting, and I think it's very important. Of course, we've had presidential candidates on the Democratic side suffer as a result of their support for this war. And I'm not just thinking of Hillary Clinton, who famously had a disadvantage against Barack Obama on that score in 2008, and Donald Trump even brought it up in 2016, as did Bernie Sanders. But I'm also thinking of John Kerry. The question remains, did John Kerry protect himself by running? But you didn't really get into the presidential question. You stayed with congressional candidates. What was the conclusion you drew from all of that? It's interesting. It's certainly a significant finding. What were your thoughts about it afterwards?
Yeah, I think you're right to flag the presidential argument, that we started obviously with recounting the fact that Hillary Clinton quite famously had this become an issue, not just in her nomination fight in 2008, which she ultimately lost, but obviously, as you mentioned at the top of the show, in 2016 against Donald Trump, who, you know, regardless of his actual position, certainly ran in his opposition, but also Bernie Sanders, who ran in his opposition against Hillary Clinton in 2016 as well. So we've seen the history of this at the presidential level. And you're right also to bring up John Kerry, because again, in 2004, we have to remember there was a strong anti-war candidate with an anti-war position in Howard Dean, and a lot of folks were drawn to it because of that. But the conventional wisdom in Washington was you had to be serious. You had to have, you know, it would be too much of a liability to have been against the war. And that was one of the calling cards of John Kerry. Despite his history and connections to the anti-war movement, he voted for the war. Again, we saw that be a problem for him in that election, and certainly not inoculate him against attacks from the Bush administration. Not too long after that, we saw the Democratic Party take a different position in 2006 and 2008. And when you look individually at a lot of the races, a lot of the Republicans who left office at that time left office in those wave elections, that Democratic wave in 2006, 2008, which was fueled on the backs of the anti-war movement, was fueled by opposition to the Iraq War. So one of the key takeaways here was the conventional wisdom in Washington about these issues is so frequently wrong. And the reality is that folks who had the moral clarity to say this is a bad idea, which was something that millions of Americans were saying at the time as well, but folks who had the courage to stand up for that conviction in Washington were rewarded for it. And folks who took a politically calculating position have not seen their political fortunes bettered.
And again, we're talking with Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War. And I love that you brought up this concept of inoculation, Stephen, because I think there had been and continues to be in some circles this sense that on war and peace issues and on other issues as well, that somehow Democrats can inoculate themselves against certain lines of attack from Republicans. And I think, my personal opinion, it's well past time for Democrats to understand that inoculation is a false hope, that Republicans will attack you from the right, no matter what you do, no matter how far you move to the right. They're going to call Barack Obama a socialist, and you know, whatever it is. So why not do the right and principled thing, the thing you know to be right? You know, I did a story, I'm going to say around 2006, about the Democratic caucus, the Senate caucus meeting, where they all agreed to support the war, even though there were members with misgivings. What I was told at the time was that John Kerry gave, and of course this was before he ran for president, gave an eloquent speech why the caucus should resist and vote against the war, but he was voted down, stuck with his caucus, and perhaps lost the presidency as a result. Now, after I published that, Kerry called me personally. It was my first brush with people reading what I write about them, to say that never happened. But other senators present off the record have said it did. So I don't know. But whatever the backstory, it seems to me that the Democrats' strategy for making sure the Republicans can't hawk them didn't work. But those politicians who voted their conscience reaped a reward, did they not?
They did, absolutely. Politicians who not only voted their conscience, but really took some time to ask basic questions. Is this going to make us safer? Does this make sense? What is the information we're being given by the Bush administration? It took us years to untangle these questions after that 2002 vote. But at the time, there was certainly enough pause that any member of Congress should have had to say, this isn't adding up. The ones who took that vote, again, they're about twice as likely to have stayed in Congress. The ones who didn't, obviously, saw the results of that vote. Now, again, there's a lot of factors, and I think one of the key takeaways here is this wasn't the determining factor in a lot of the futures of members of Congress. We certainly know on the House side the gerrymandering that takes place, and certainly in the hyperpartisanship we've seen, these wave elections matter. So members of Congress, Democrats, tended to lose their office in 2010, regardless of their position for or against. But those who took their position based on their principles, based on their values, found it easier to defend later. And those who took it based on a political calculation, when that political calculation caught up with them, they sure didn't have a good answer for that vote.
There's an interesting other aspect of this story, and it has to do with 2016. I don't know if you saw the article or the study, Stephen, but after the 2016 election, a political scientist said that the votes for Trump in swing states were higher than expected in states that had higher than average casualty rates from the Iraq conflict. Did you see that by any chance?
I did, absolutely. And we're doing some further research we're hoping to track down for on this exact issue a little bit later in the summer. But I think it's pretty logical. The folks who have seen this war closest firsthand, not just Iraq, but the broader endless war we now have in the Middle East, we see this time and time again in our conversations. Even as an organization with a name like Win Without War, we do a lot of work with folks in the military community, folks who have retired, veterans from the military community, folks who've seen these wars firsthand. They don't need a talking head in Washington to tell them that these wars were a bad idea. They don't need to read some sort of treatise or a dissertation on what went wrong. They lived it. They saw it. They understood the lies that were so important in selling this war just were utter falsehoods. They experienced that firsthand. So it's not surprising at all that folks who had that experience, folks who lived through these mistakes, believe that there should be consequences for that. And that's not to say that those folks are super liberal or they've become major Democrats. Many of them, in fact, are very conservative Republicans. But when you see the military constantly being put into battle, when you see men and women in uniform being injured, being killed, in wars that their military officers say do not have a military solution, it's not surprising that at the end of the day, folks start to look for political leaders who will stop putting them in harm's way.
I think that's such a great point, Stephen. And I've talked to a lot of veterans myself and career military folks, probably not as much as you guys have, but enough to get the sense that, when you've served in the military, which I have not, but my sense I get from people who have served in the military, including close members of my own family, I had an aunt who was career military, they don't mythologize war or generals or somehow it's civilians who've never been in it who sometimes think, well, war will solve all our problems. The people who've been through war know the limitations of what war can do for you, and they've also seen the suffering and the death. And I think that leavens people and it wounds people, and it gives people a different perspective, and maybe one of the reasons why, for example, Wisconsin voted the way it did in 2016. So with the minute or so we have left, what are some lessons from the Iraq vote that our political leaders should be aware of now and going forward as we consider, for example, there was just a vote on Yemen that I found disappointing because this government will continue to provide support to the Saudis in that humanitarian crisis there. But with this and other potential conflicts, what are the lessons that lawmakers and the rest of us should bear in mind going forward?
Well, I think the number one lesson should be that members of Congress, senators who are considering these votes, ought not to consider short-term political expediency. They ought to do their constitutional obligation to weigh whether or not we should be involved in these wars. And if they in their guts feel that we should not be involved, then they ought to vote that way, because chances are that war is not going to turn out well, and the voters are ultimately going to hold them accountable. And I think this is one of the most amazing things about our Constitution that's often missed with these issues. The reason it's Congress, not the presidency, but Congress who's supposed to decide this most foundational question of when we go to war and where we go to war is because the framers wanted it to be hard. They wanted people who had to answer to voters frequently and regularly to be held accountable for these votes, because they knew that if you can't sell it to your constituents, if you can't sell it to the American public, we probably shouldn't be doing it. And so we have to break ourselves of this process that we've been in now for the last 15 years, where we no longer vote on America's wars. We no longer vote on these military operations that go on year after year. It is precisely because it is supposed to be hard that this was the power given to Congress, the body of government closest to the American public. And it should not be surprising that the American public uses those votes to hold their members of Congress accountable, but we can't do that if Congress doesn't actually vote. And so I think that, while we share your disappointment that more senators didn't vote to end the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, it was positive to see that for the first time in 3 years of American support in that war, we finally forced a vote. We need to see a whole lot more of that in the years ahead, and I look forward to coming back and talking about the accountability of how folks who voted on that war face in the future.
Well, another great point, so thanks for making it. And Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War, thanks for all your good work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks. Good talking to you, RJ.